What if I told you that five young men went out for a fun night, watched a basketball game, and were never seen alive again? No one could have imagined that this night would lead to one of the most baffling and disturbing mysteries California has ever witnessed. Their car was found abandoned on a lonely mountain road, their bodies scattered miles apart, except for one man who was never found. Decades later, no one knows why they were there or what really happened. This is the story of the Yuba County Five, a case that leaves more questions than answers even to this day. This case takes us back to February of 1978. Five friends from Yuba County, California, men who were described as friendly, close-knit, and passionate about sports disappeared after attending a basketball game at California State University, Chico. These five men were not just typical young adults, they faced unique challenges and their lives were anything but ordinary. When they failed to return home that night, their families and the entire community were thrown into a nightmare of confusion and fear. What should have been a fun, routine night turned into a dark mystery. The discovery of their abandoned car days after they were last seen only deepened the confusion. Found on a snow-covered, remote mountain road in the Plumas National Forest, the car was in perfect working condition, yet there was no sign of the men. Why had they left the car behind? Why were they in that area in the first place? These questions began a tragic search that led to some horrifying discoveries, but not all the answers. And here's the part that continues to haunt investigators and true crime enthusiasts alike. After months of searching, four of the men were found dead, but one man, Gary Mathias, was never found. What happened to him, and why did these five men, ill prepared for the wilderness, end up in such a remote and dangerous place? This is a mystery that has haunted Yuba County for over 40 years, and today we're going to dive into it. Let's take a closer look at the five men whose disappearance would shock an entire community. These were no strangers to each other. They were friends, bonded by shared interests and a love of sports. First, there was Gary Mathias, a man in his 20s who struggled with schizophrenia. Despite this, Gary had been managing his condition with medication and was close to his family and friends. Then there was Jack Madruga, a responsible and steady man who had served in the army. He was fiercely independent, and his prized possession was the car he drove, his beloved turquoise and white Mercury Montego. Bill Sterling was gentle and caring, deeply religious, and known for helping others. Alongside him was Jack Hewitt, shy and a little socially awkward, but always dependable. Jack loved his family, especially his mother, and was known for being kind-hearted. Lastly, there was Ted Weiher, the oldest of the group, known for his joyful personality and his special bond with his mother, who he cared for dearly. Ted was always the one to bring laughter and lightheartedness to the group. These men, while full of love and life, also had their vulnerabilities. Some had intellectual disabilities, others had mental health challenges. But what united them was a shared enthusiasm for sports basketball in particular. The night they disappeared, they were excited to watch a game and more so for their own Special Olympics basketball match scheduled for the next day. They weren't just friends, they were a team bound together by their differences and their dreams. But this close-knit bond would lead them down a path none of them could have foreseen, a path that ended in tragedy for four of them and total disappearance for one. Their story is not just one of mystery, but also of heartache and confusion. How could a group of friends with so much to live for simply vanish, leaving behind a trail of questions no one has been able to fully answer? That's what makes the Yuba County Five such a perplexing case, a puzzle that still, decades later, refuses to be solved. February 24th, 1978 started as an ordinary evening for the Yuba County Five. They piled into Jack Madruga's prized Mercury Montego, a car he took great care of, and set off to California State University, Chico, to watch a college basketball game. For these men, this night was a moment of fun, camaraderie, and excitement. But their real thrill was set for the next day when they were scheduled to play in their own Special Olympics basketball game. Winning that game was all they had been talking about. The excitement was palpable as they looked forward to their big moment. The group was happy, relaxed, and everything seemed normal as they left the game in Chico. But what happened after they left the university remains the heart of the mystery. The route home was straightforward, but instead of driving back to Yuba City, the men took a baffling detour, heading east into the rugged terrain of the Sierra Nevada mountains. This area was completely out of the way, unfamiliar to them, and far from their intended path. Why would they choose to drive up a dangerous mountain road in the middle of a cold February night? The questions pile up. Were they lost? Were they running from something? Or did they encounter someone along the way who forced them to take this unknown route? What we do know is that the night ended with them vanishing into the wilderness, and that decision to take that remote mountain road became the first inexplicable clue in a case full of them. 4 days later, on February 28, 1978, the first concrete clue emerged. A park ranger found Jack Madruga's Mercury Montego abandoned on a desolate stretch of road in the Plumas National Forest, about 70 miles from Chico. The car was stuck in snow, but here's where things took a bizarre turn. The car was still in perfect working order. It had gas in the tank, the keys were missing, but when authorities later tested it, the engine started up immediately. There was no mechanical failure, no sign that the car had broken down. Even more puzzling was what was inside the car. The windows were rolled down, something unusual for such cold weather. In the back seat were candy wrappers, empty cartons, and maps, nothing unusual, except for the fact that these men were last seen on a basketball outing and were not prepared for a winter trek in the mountains. None of them were dressed for the freezing temperatures of that night. So, why did they abandon the car? It wasn't buried so deep in the snow that they couldn't have pushed it free. And why would they walk into the wilderness unprepared for the cold? The nearest help was miles away, and the car would have provided more shelter than the snowy, bitterly cold forest. There was no sign of foul play inside the car, no struggle, no damage, and no clues to explain why 5 young men would leave behind a functioning vehicle in such a dangerous environment. The discovery of the car raised more questions than it answered. Why leave the safety of a perfectly good car? Why were they up there in the first place? And what could have made 5 men walk into the unforgiving Sierra Nevada wilderness with no supplies, no coats, and no clear reason for doing so? These questions would only deepen as search efforts began, but the discovery of the Mercury Montego was just the beginning of a mystery that continues to defy explanation. As soon as the Mercury Montego was discovered abandoned in the middle of nowhere, the hunt for the missing Yuba County Five began in full force. The authorities spared no effort in trying to find the men. Helicopters scoured the dense, snow-covered wilderness from above, while ground teams with snowmobiles and dogs combed through the rugged terrain. They searched every trail, every hidden corner of the Plumas National Forest. Volunteers joined the rescue efforts, and the community held its breath, hoping for some sign of life, but days passed with no trace of the men. With no immediate leads, early theories began to surface. One theory suggested that they had gotten lost while taking a scenic detour. But even that didn't quite make sense. These men were not familiar with the area, and they had no reason to be out on those dangerous mountain roads in the first place. So why were they up there? Some began to wonder whether they had encountered foul play. Maybe they were fleeing from someone or something. There was even speculation that perhaps they had seen something they shouldn't have, and that forced them off the road into the wilderness. Then there was the theory that something had gone wrong within the group itself. Could someone have panicked or acted irrationally? This led investigators to focus on Gary Mathias, the only member of the group who had a known history of mental illness. Gary had schizophrenia, which he managed with medication, but what if something triggered a psychotic break that night? His medication was vital to his stability, and without it, he could become unpredictable. Authorities began to wonder if Gary's condition played a role in the group's disappearance. But without any evidence, it was just another question in a sea of unanswered ones. The search dragged on for months, but by late spring, hope was beginning to fade. The thick forest and unforgiving wilderness seemed determined to keep its secrets. It wasn't until June, 4 months after the men vanished, that the grim truth began to emerge. On a warm day in June 1978, a group of motorcyclists was riding through the Plumas National Forest, about 20 miles from where the Mercury Montego had been found. They stumbled upon something strange, a Forest Service trailer sitting eerily quiet in the middle of the wilderness. Curiosity got the better of them, and when they stepped inside, they were met with a scene straight out of a nightmare. Inside the trailer, the body of Ted Weiher was found lying on a bed, wrapped in several sheets. His body was emaciated, he had starved to death, despite there being enough food in the trailer to last several weeks. There were cans of food, some of which had been opened and eaten, but it was clear that Ted had survived for a long time before succumbing to the harsh conditions. He had lost nearly half his body weight, and his feet were severely frostbitten. But what was most disturbing was the fact that there was a working propane heater in the trailer that had never been used. The men had all the resources they needed to survive, yet they didn't take advantage of them. Why? Not far from the trailer, searchers found the remains of Jack Hewitt and Bill Sterling, both scattered in the open forest, ravaged by animals. It was clear they hadn't survived long. The discovery of these bodies deepened the mystery. Why hadn't the men stayed together? Why had they wandered so far from safety? And again, why hadn't they used the food and heater that could have saved their lives? But the biggest question remained, where was Gary Mathias? Of all the men, his body was never found, and his disappearance adds a chilling layer to an already confusing case. Did Gary survive longer than the others? Did he leave the group and wander off on his own? Or was there something darker at play? The tragic discovery of Ted, Jack, and Bill's bodies raised more questions than it answered. How could they have survived for so long only to die in a place where help was within reach? What caused them to abandon the supplies that could have saved them? And most hauntingly of all, what really happened to Gary Mathias? The answers to these questions remain elusive, and the mystery of the Yuba County Five continues to baffle investigators and true crime enthusiasts alike. Out of the 5 men who vanished that cold February night in 1978, one remains a ghost in this mystery: Gary Mathias. His body was never found. While the remains of his friends were tragically discovered in or near the trailer, Gary simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind only speculation and fear. His disappearance adds an unsettling layer to an already confusing case. What happened to Gary? Did he succumb to the wilderness like his friends and his body simply wasn't found? Or is there something far more disturbing lurking beneath the surface? Gary Mathias, as we know, had a history of schizophrenia. His mental health was a delicate balance, carefully managed with medication. But what if, on that night, he was without his meds? People with schizophrenia, when untreated, can experience delusions, hallucinations, or paranoia, which might explain irrational decisions made by the group. Some have theorized that Gary, in a state of mental instability, may have led the group into the wilderness on a misguided mission. But there is no solid evidence to suggest that Gary was directly responsible for what happened that night. Still, there's a lingering question. Could Gary have survived longer than the others? The trailer offered enough supplies for weeks, and some theorize that perhaps Gary left the trailer seeking help while the others stayed behind, too weak or confused to follow. Did Gary wander off into the endless expanse of the Sierra Nevada, never to be found? Or is there a more sinister possibility that Gary's survival instinct kicked in and something darker occurred? His disappearance remains one of the most frustrating aspects of this case. Search teams scoured the area where the other bodies were found, but Gary was nowhere. Could he have gone further into the wilderness, or did something happen that took him far away from the rest of the group? The absence of answers about Gary Mathias' fate continues to fuel endless speculation, and his vanishing act leaves this case chillingly incomplete. Perhaps the most maddening question in the entire Yuba County 5 case is why the men didn't use the resources available in the trailer. Ted Weiher clearly survived for weeks, yet he starved to death in a place where food was readily available. There were cans of food that had been opened and eaten, but so much more remained untouched. Even more baffling is the fact that there was a fully operational propane heater in the trailer, yet it was never turned on. The bitter cold that the men faced could have been defeated with the flip of a switch, but that simple step was never taken. Why? It's easy to look at the situation from a distance and wonder why these men, who were in such dire circumstances, didn't take the steps to save themselves. Panic could have played a significant role. In life threatening situations, the mind doesn't always think clearly. Perhaps the men were so overwhelmed by fear, hunger, and confusion that they couldn't make rational decisions. Ted Weiher, who had intellectual disabilities, might not have fully understood how to use the heater, or perhaps he was too weak by the time he realized it was there. But there's also the unsettling possibility that something else was driving their behavior. Could the group have been fleeing from someone or something? Could they have been too afraid to stay in the trailer for long, even though it offered shelter and warmth? Or did their mental state, possibly worsened by Gary Mathias' schizophrenia, lead to a breakdown in their decision making? Another theory is that their isolation in the wilderness led to confusion and paranoia, especially after days of exposure to the harsh elements. The human mind can play cruel tricks when faced with extreme survival situations. The men might have convinced themselves that they needed to leave the trailer and find help, even though staying put would have been their best chance of survival. This is where the audience can reflect: what would you have done in their shoes? It's easy to assume we would have made different decisions, but when faced with life threatening cold, starvation, and fear, the mind doesn't always work the way we think it will. The case of the Yuba County Five shows us just how fragile human logic can be when survival is on the line. These unanswered questions are what make this case so haunting. Why didn't they turn on the heater? Why didn't they eat the food that could have saved them? And most importantly, what drove them into the wilderness in the first place? The lack of answers keeps this mystery alive, as chilling today as it was all those decades ago. The story of the Yuba County Five leaves us with a staggering amount of unanswered questions. Over the years, countless theories have emerged to explain what might have happened that night, each one more puzzling than the last. Could it be that the men simply got lost, driven off course by a wrong turn and a series of bad decisions? The simplest theory is often the most logical. They could have panicked in the unfamiliar mountain terrain, becoming disoriented in the dark, cold night. But even then, why abandon a perfectly functioning car? Why walk into the freezing wilderness when safety was just a turn of the ignition away? Then there's the more unsettling possibility that they were being chased. Some believe the men encountered someone or something that forced them to flee. Was there an immediate danger we don't know about? Did they witness something illegal, something they shouldn't have seen? Perhaps they ran into a sinister operation deep in the forest, and the only option was to flee into the darkness. It's a chilling thought, but it could explain why they ended up in such an isolated area and why their decision making seemed so frantic. Gary Mathias' role in this mystery has also sparked significant speculation. As the only man whose body was never found, some wonder if he may have been responsible for what happened. Did his untreated schizophrenia take over, leading him to make irrational or dangerous decisions that impacted the group? There's no hard evidence to support this theory, but his disappearance keeps it alive. Did Gary survive, abandoning the others and vanishing into the wild? Or did something happen to him, something we'll never fully understand? Conspiracy theories swirl around this case too. Some speculate that the group might have stumbled upon something illegal like drug activity and had to run for their lives. Others suggest they were victims of a more organized crime, perhaps even a cover up. the fact that Gary Mathias had a military background coupled with his disappearance has led some to believe that his past may have caught up with him. But as intriguing as these conspiracy theories are, they remain speculation, fueled by the fact that we still have no definitive answers. The Yuba County Five case forces us to confront a mystery that defies easy explanation. And in the end, every theory raises as many questions as it answers. What's your theory? Do you believe the men simply got lost, or do you think there was something far more sinister at play? The beauty and tragedy of this case is that it remains unsolved, allowing each of us to form our own conclusions, however unsettling they may be. As we reach the end of this harrowing tale, one thing becomes clear: the mystery of the Yuba County Five has outlived the men themselves. For over 4 decades, their disappearance has haunted the minds of investigators, families, and true crime enthusiasts alike. The fact that we still don't know what really happened only makes the case more disturbing. How can 5 men simply vanish into the wilderness, leaving behind a trail of confusion, fear, and tragedy? For the families of the men, this mystery is not just a story, it's a source of lifelong heartache. They've had to live with the agonizing uncertainty of what happened to their loved ones, never getting the answers they deserve. Ted Weiher's mother, in particular, spent years struggling to understand how her son, a man so full of life, could die in such a tragic, senseless way. And Gary Mathias' family has lived with the unbearable possibility that he may still be out there, somewhere, lost or worse. The pain of not knowing is, in many ways, worse than any truth. The Yuba County Five have become local legends in California, their story retold in hushed tones, with each retelling more chilling than the last. The area where their car was found is now synonymous with the unknown, a place where something terrible happened, but no one can say exactly what. The case has taken on a life of its own, drawing in armchair detectives and professional investigators alike, all trying to piece together the puzzle that remains as elusive as it was in 1978. And yet, despite all the attention, all the theories, and all the searching, this case remains unsolved. We are left with nothing but questions. Why did the men go up that mountain? Why did they abandon the safety of their car? Why didn't they use the food and supplies that could have saved their lives? And most haunting of all, what happened to Gary Mathias? The legacy of the Yuba County Five is one of unanswered questions, a haunting reminder that some mysteries will never be solved. It's a case that keeps you up at night, a story that lingers in the back of your mind, forcing you to wonder what really happened out there in the wilderness, and will we ever truly know?